Johnson, and this is Focus on Liberia. Hit it! From Cape Mount to Cape Palmer, Mount Nimba to Atlantic Ocean, Obomi Hills to Pokonjre, to educate, elevate, and promote. Talk about home affairs, hey, in diaspora, current affairs, hey, reliable information, history, talking about culture, hey, politics, education, entertainment, business, sports, advertisement, articulation. Focus on Liberia. Focus on Liberia. Focus on Liberia. From Monday to Sunday.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this edition of the Liberia History Channel on Focus on Liberia. My name is Dennis Jah, and we are broadcasting from Atlanta, Georgia. In tonight's edition of the Liberia History Channel, we're going to be in search of King Peter. Well, if you read Liberian history, you will hear about King Peter. Who is King Peter? Is there one King Peter, many King Peters? Who? And so we want to find the real King Peter tonight. And so stay tuned. Let me welcome our presenter, Carl Family. Carl, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Dennis. It's always my pleasure to be here.
And let me welcome all our viewers from across the globe. If it is Saturday, is the Liberia History Channel right here on Focus on Liberia. I want you to invite your friend. Let's study Liberian history. This is something that most of us were not taught in high school and even universities. So we have the opportunity now to learn what we did not learn. We're happy to have our presenter, Carl Family. Carl, why are we in search of King Peter again?
We're in search of King Peter because I think, first of all, this is a significant dynasty on the Grain Coast. It's the legacy of power being shifted from father to son and on down the line. So this is a big deal. It's not something that we ever really talk about. We kind of, have this idea of an existence of statelessness before the Republic was established. And so we need to go back and really understand what the written records, the documented record shows about statehood, about kingdoms, about what existed before the devastation caused by the transatlantic slave trade, what existed during that devastating period, and also what occurred at the moment and at the time period that our founders were repatriated to the coast. So it needs to be examined because there's not enough attention paid to it. And I find it very, very fascinating. One of the greatest misconceptions that I've come across when talking to Liberians about history is that it was the American Colonization Society and the repatriated African Americans who came on shore in 1822 and introduced the idea of Western names to people, and so this is, of course, absurd, but for some reason, we have been made to believe that Liberia, which is really in the center of the world, if you look at it, was somehow isolated and didn't have, interaction with Europeans or Western names until ACS arrived. And that's an unfortunate mindsets. So we need to correct it, first of all, because it's not true. And also it's very dehumanizing and degrading to those who were there before the Republic was established. So the truth needs to be told. And these people should not be forgotten.
And that is very important that if you listen to fellow Liberians, and I myself, I didn't know for a long time, that the names that we got, they say, oh, this person was this. And when the former slaves came, they gave them this name. This person was this. So all these names were given to people by after, 1822, when the settlers arrived. That, according to what we have learned so far on the History Channel, is not true. It's not true. And tonight we're going to do more. In search of King Peter, his kingdom and his dynasty.
Yes.
This is fascinating.
So this map is from the year 1470, and it is a map that was drawn, basically Portuguese map that was drawn around 1470 of the area that we call Liberia today. So this is a copy of that map. This is important because the year 1470, Columbus had not yet stumbled across the Americas. The majority of the world didn't even know the existence of North and South America. There had been no transatlantic slave trade yet. And here are the Portuguese exploring and trading and interacting with the people whose descendants would later become Liberians. So this is the history not only of indigenous Liberians, but also of repatriated Liberians, because their ancestors hadn't yet been sold into slavery. So this is everyone's history. When you're talking about 1470, you're talking about the history of the African world before there was a significant diaspora.
Oh, wow. I'm letting that sink in a little bit. This is 1460 to 1510, this map. So
the map is specific. The map itself was 1470.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So at this time, there's no transatlantic slavery yet. So people that were sold into the West, they are still there. So their hearts are there, I can see. Right? This is very important.
Yeah. So the ancestors, the forefathers of the people who would return, Joseph Jenkins Roberts' ancestors, Elijah Johnson's ancestors, Hillary Teague's African ancestors, had not left the continent of Africa yet.
And it was at this time the Portuguese are visiting and doing business with us.
Right. I mean, you have even older accounts of interactions with people at the Grain Coast going back to the Carthaginians, 900, 1200 years ago. You also, prior to any coastal trade, you always had this long distance trade across the belt of the Savannah into Asia, and also across the Sahara Desert into Asia. That was thousands of years. So we're talking about West Africa being very critical in global trade and the development of the world long before even Atlantic coastal trade evolved with the Europeans traveling up and down the coast. So we have, in this context, we're however focused on the Grain Coast and the European documented record. But there's been no point in any recorded history over the last 2,000 years that this was an isolated place.
Right. And Carl, we do that in Liberian history. It's just that we don't focus on it, right? Because, that period, all the way back, thousands of years, we have that in the history, right? But I don't think we give it much prominence to say, oh, okay, because people were coming to us and we were trading, we were interacting with other people. I don't know why the marker is placed so definitely in 1822 as if that was the beginning of our interaction with other people.
Because what I found is, especially working with young people in Liberia, when we're doing the ethical citizenship courses, what I found is that their understanding is that these empires were somebody else. Okay. That the people that they descend from had no connection to those global trade networks. not realizing that the rice and the gold and the ivory was coming from them, because this was the source of the wealth. So they didn't know this because it isn't told to them. They talk about Ghana Mali Songe like it's those Bambara people, it's also Ninke people, it's somebody else.
Oh yes. Yes.
In this context, we realize very adamantly that empires encompassed the people of the rainforest belt. In fact, the people in the forest were the ones supplying the gold and the ivory and the agricultural goods, rice. So this is important, and this isn't taught in school this way. They are omitted. Their role in creating the modern world is omitted from history, unfortunately.
And take this question, for instance. Moses Thomas said that means people were living in Liberia before slavery began in the West. It looks like a simple question, but that kind of that's an embodiment of what we were taught, right? You just said it.
Right. And the concept is the average historian, their idea is that there was an empty land, or it was just swamps and a few bands of tribesmen. And this is an outrage. It's an outrage. And it's not only the descendants of repatriates that are taught this, everybody is taught this. And they believe it, but it doesn't actually, the records don't support this. I mean, right next door in Sierra Leone, archaeological records date human settlement back over 10,000 years. Right next door in Ivory Coast, same thing. But for some reason, Liberians think, this particular stretch of land, they inaccurately and incorrectly believe it was empty. But we're going to prove beyond any reasonable doubt that was not the case. And not only that, we have to also understand that if this land was empty, it would have been settled by Europeans long before ACS came. There were many attempts by Europeans, but there was such a sophisticated and organized central authority in this region that they were resistant to turning over their trading rights to Europeans. They wanted to maintain control of their resources. And we're going to show how that plays out throughout history, and even made it possible for ACS to settle at the Grain Coast, at Cape Mesurado.
Another reason could it be that to make the ACS look almighty, like, hey, there was nothing here. We came and established something and make this a place. Really, before then, there was nothing here. Is that why? Is that another reason?
Well, I don't know if that is the reason. I think that is the result. That's what ends up happening. If that was the plan, I can't say. But certainly the result of teaching history in this way, that is what it is. It then creates this concept that it is only that the land was void, and therefore, we came and planted a seed and the seed grew. But the seed grew on fertile soil. The seed grew on a legacy that was already well established. So we've spoken many, many times in the past about this concept of sovereign Africans existing in their sovereign state, controlling their own resources, controlling their right to economic self-determination long before the transatlantic slave trade. So we've discussed this in great depth, in great detail. So when we talk about the King Peters of Cape Mesurado, the King Peters, and I put an S there, you'll soon see why. This dynasty that descends, we're going to go back to the oldest known king, who is the oldest ancestor of the kings that we refer to as Peter. And King Peter Brumley, who we all incorrectly call Zolu Duma, which, Dr. Patrick Burroughs has very much, debunked this, and many others, that Zolu Duma was another King Peter in Cape Mount, not King Peter Brumley, who the bridge should have been named after. These are all the ancestors of these people. We're going to start looking at them. So we're going to go very far back in history and show what the documented record shows of their family tree. It's very, very interesting.
And let's start with Candia.
Candia. Candibia. King Candibia, and if you want to research this, they usually spell it Cadibia, Caddibiah, Cadibia. And there are several books that document him and what he did, but this is a man who lived in the 1400s. This man was first encountered by the Portuguese in the 1400s. So, around 1470, at the time that they were mapping the Grain Coast, they came across a man they called Cadibia, which our Crow, Basa, and Grebo linguistic people, mostly Basa, have come up with. This is Candibia, was the way the name would have been actually called. This is the earliest known monarch, king, ruler at the Grain Coast. And he had an actual kingdom. So Candibia was not only ruling a little town, he had a kingdom, meaning people from other ethnic groups, or what we call tribes, were part of his kingdom. He was their monarch. So almost a small empire, because it was a domination of multiple groups of people. Later on, if you fast forward from 1470 to 1822, by the time ACS arrives, the southeast, what we consider to be the southeastern part of Liberia, and Ivory Coast were mostly what anthropologists classify as stateless societies. This is evidence that before they became decentralized and stateless, and little town, nation states, the city-states onto themselves, there was indeed a kingdom that encompassed and umbrellaed all of them. This is important because the records show that this is the case in earlier times. The Portuguese, the French, the English, all documented kingdoms. So there's no reason for us to talk about Liberians not having centralized authority prior to this, because it's obviously not true. Whether things had broken down by the time we get to 1822 is a different issue. Doesn't mean this is how it always was. So go ahead, Dennis.
So King Candibia and his fathers before him were well accustomed to trading with Europeans. It was the Portuguese who gave the Sestos River the name.
So Candibia was the king of the region around Sestos, the river Sestos. But this stretched all the way to the St. John River, which is in modern-day Bassa, and all the way to the Kavala, which is in modern-day Maryland County. So his range of control at that time in history was a pretty good-sized kingdom.
Yeah.
Encompassed basically almost all of Liberia, with the exception of, at this time in the 1400s, it didn't cover Monserrato and Cape Mount, going into Sherbro, Galenas and Sherbro. And we know this because that area at the time was part of what was called Kingdom Koya. So Koya Kingdom was a rival kingdom adjacent to Candibia's kingdom. So the river marked the boundary. So we'll go on to the next, unless you have a question, we'll go on to the next slide.
Yeah, that's good. And it's documented because we all know most of these names in Liberia, they were Portuguese names. So dating as far back as 14 something. So this is something.
That particular map was 1470. And then the reason it had the range at the top is because that's the time range of the article that it was taken from.
So as you said, Candibia's kingdom stretched along the coast from the St. John River to Crow, close to the present-day town of Setra Crew.
Yeah. So Kaufman says Setra Crew, but the Portuguese travelers stretched his kingdom all the way to the Kavala, or what they call the Kavali, right? Kaufman, in her 2017 book, Black to Doer, she says Cetra Cru. I believe the Portuguese primary source more, but I wanted to also cite what she wrote.
Yeah.
So this is, okay, go ahead and read, Dennis.
The king and his subjects were the most certain of the Kru people, known as Zigobos. Is this word is no. They spoke a variant of language called Kwao, in which the people Bo addressed their leader as Dabo. The small village where Candia and his family lived was surrounded by palm and banana trees and situated just a few miles up the river Cestus.
Yes. So Kaufman's also citing, the Zeguebos. We talked about this before. I believe that those are what we call Grebo people today. Kwao, of course, what we call Kru people today. This is important because it links these languages. Now, were these all the same people under Candia, and then when they became decentralized, their languages started to drift apart, and then they become separate people? Or were they completely separate people, and during this period when they were all under the thumb of Candia, their languages started to merge? This is something I don't know. This is something that linguists have to study. But clearly, we're talking about a language family of people that still exist in Liberia today, which are the modern-day Bassa, Grebo, Kru, and some of the Kra and others that are related, other related languages. So what decentralization or the disbursement of the central authority did is it weakened and almost degenerated the populations, because now you don't have this sophisticated trade network. What you find later after the slave trade, or at the end, towards the end of the slave trade, is a decentralized bands of small villages that each have a head onto themselves, but are not paying tribute or under the authority of a central power. And they were much weaker and much less sophisticated than their ancestors were because of war and devastation. We can go to the next slide. So this is very interesting because I remember reading about John Davis when I was young, I think in high school. And it never occurred to me that this man was an ancestor of modern day Liberians, because he was from Cestos, from the river Cestos. This was Candibia's son. But this is a very famous person in British history, because this was an African prince that they called John Davis. His native indigenous name was Dedewi Yakwa. Dedewi Yakwa. Now, Black Tudors, they spell it with the letter R as in Richard or Robert, because they did not know, because of course our people don't have the letter R in our dialects, and the Europeans constantly hear our L's and other things as the letter R and always write R, like Banga, they say Baranga, and so on. But it's actually Dedewi Yakwa. And the prince, he was the prince of the river Cestos. This man later on returns home after acquiring an education. This is an actual sketch, actually, that hangs in the British Museum of this man from the Cestos River, who changed his own name to John Davis after being baptized in England. And so this name, John Davis, he is an ancestor of the King Peters. And he's the first documented person that I've come across with a European name. First documented African I've come across from our Grain Coast with a European name. Now, we've had Africans before him who carried Arabic names, but this is the first, or well, Asian names, because Arabic is Asian, but this is the first I've seen of an African, especially from the Grain Coast, with a European name. And no, it was not forced upon him. He was baptized and he chose this name willingly.
John
Go ahead,
Davis.
Ben. And again, this photo is sourced from Black Fedors.
King Dedewi Yakwa John Davis was born around the year 1591. He was the son of Candia, king of River Cestus.
So he was the son of Candia, king of River Cestus. And he was taken to England to study because his father was a trader, traded with Europeans. His father could speak Portuguese. The British were late in the game to trade with the people of the Cestus Empire and kingdom. So he thought it would be wise to send his son with a haberdasher named John Davis. And he kind of took this very young man into England. They sent him to school. He learned to read and write and speak English. He also was baptized, became a Christian, adapted his mentor's name, John Davis, and he returned home to River Cestus. So when he returned home, he, took over his father's kingdom after his father's death. But he became very useful because he not only could speak English well, he could read and write, and he understood the rules of British commerce, of the Europeans, how they conducted business. So it put him at an advantage. There is no more of this, blind ignorance. He understands Europeans. He understands their goals, what they're coming to do. And so he puts into place a system where he, after he succeeds his father Candia, he makes sure that he is in command of the trade in his territory. Though they allow some Europeans to set up small settlements, trade posts, they must pay taxes to him because he understands their system. They're not going to be the middlemen. Right. He's going to be the middleman. He's going to be the person that puts the gate between African resources and European traders, therefore charging them tariffs and taxes in order to trade. This was possible because his understanding of how these people did business. He was able to utilize it.
So he knew about interest rates and all that, right? So
he understood his assignment. His father did well by sending him into Europe, into England to study, and he came back and applied the knowledge, not for the benefit of the Europeans, but for the benefit of the kingdom of Cestus. So we have to think about it today. When you go away to go to school on these government scholarships, are you coming back to advance the cause of imperialism, of economic imperialism against your country? Or are you returning to advance your country's position, trade position in the world? This is 1591. You have this young man returning. I'm sorry, 1591 is when he was born. You have in the early 1600s this young man returning and understanding his assignment.
Yeah.
How many of our scholars that go abroad to study have this type of understanding today?
That's a rhetorical question. So Dedewi Yakwa, about the age of 20, the son of Candia, king of River Cestus in the country of Guinea, who was sent out of his country by his father in an English ship called the Abigail of London, belonging to Mr. John Davis of this parish, to be baptized. At the request of the said Mr. Davis, and at the desire of the said Dedewi, and by allowance of authority, he was by the passing of this church the 1st of January baptized and named John. His sureties were John Davis, Herbert Dasher, Isaac Kibron Mercer, Robert Singleton Churchwarden, Edmund Towers, Paul Gorgini, and Rebecca Hutchins. He showed his opinion concerning Jesus Christ and his faith in him. He repeated the Lord's Prayer in English at the font and so was baptized and signed with the sign of the cross.
So this is not a situation of slavery and forced imposition of religion. This is a person who is willingly adopting a religion. This is a person who has gone willingly to study. This is a person who has acquired knowledge and will later return home and use that information that he's been able to gather in Europe to benefit and advance the cause of his people. And he did so successfully. So there was a period of prosperity before his travels and an increased period of prosperity after his return, because now he understood the value of the goods they were trading with the Europeans. Because he had been to Europe, he had seen that the ivory was converted into piano keys and buttons and pens and jewelry and all kinds of fine items that the very rich and powerful used. So he understood that ivory wasn't something that you just throw away. He understood the value of gold in these cultures. He understood the need for the spices that they were trading. He understood that on the ship, if you had rice, it was more valuable than gold because it wasn't perishable. And you could keep it for long periods of time and cook it and eat it and survive. So he understood the value of the things that had been traded by his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather, as they said, before him.
I have a friend from Sino. He was telling me there's a tree, they use that in the Sapo people land to brush their teeth. It's bitter. So now people are coming from Ghana and they are buying these trees for something like as little as maybe $15 Liberian. And so they went and they asked, they said, these are important. They say, oh, what we got to do with trees? Who care about them? So you tell them, so now with Brother John Davis, he went there and those things that they've been selling maybe so cheaply, he realized the value and he's coming back to say, hey, this is what we are selling. This is what we are giving away almost free.
Right.
And this is in 1611, because from 1591 to 20 years, it's 1611.
And I want to point something out. In the year 1611, the first enslaved African had not reached North America yet. The first enslaved African reached North America in the year 1619.
Wow.
So this is all of our history.
Still intact with all our genesis.
Okay, so this is before the devastation, really, right? So you don't have a single enslaved African in what would become the United States at this period of time. And here is John Davis with the name John Davis. And the year is 1619. I'm sorry, 1611. And 1619, which is the first year the enslaved Africans arrived at Jamestown, had not happened yet.
Comrade John Davis was still on the soil.
He stayed on the soil and he had children, and those children's children are still on the soil. And here you have a map by the French of the River Sestos area. If you see up there in the upper center, there's something that says La Ville Royale. That's Kingstown, the King's Village, the Kingstown. That is where Candia had his home. And later John Davis had his home. So these are the ancestors of the King Peters that we talk about in Liberian history. These are the direct ancestors. So Candia brings forth John Davis. And we'll go to the next slide. And John Davis, when he returns from England, he has a son that he names Peter.
Oh, of course. Since it's John, it got to be the next disciple, which is Peter. So
he has his son, and he names his son Peter. I want that to sink in for everybody. Dedewiyakwa goes to England because Candia sent him to study. He becomes baptized. He becomes Christian, changes his name to John Davis, still calls himself Yeyia John Davis, goes back to Sestos, rules as king, has a son and names his son Peter. Names his son Peter. And the Europeans referred to him as King Peter Basso, Father Rock. Father Rock the Great. The Iron Man, the wicked King Peter Basso, but we'll get into that. He ends up being a prolific slave trader. Yeyia did not engage in the slave trade. Candia did not engage. These people were trading in commodities. By the time King Peter's son becomes an older man, he gets involved in the slave trade. And mind you, many of the goods they're trading with Europeans for are weapons, guns, ammunition. Guns and ammunition.
So this is Babel's sketch of his meeting with King Basso or Peter of River Sestos, 1681. The hands on the right, and I'm still using, this is still not 1690 yet, it's 1681.
Yes.
The hands on the right were shortly afterwards killed and cooked to seal the trading agreement.
So the French trader / explorer, Jean Barbeau, drew this sketch. And that is King Peter, I will call him King Peter the First, King Peter I, because this is the first King Peter. This is the son of John Davis. King Peter is the one seated with a gigantic crown on his head, almost like what you see a lot of the Mende and Vai masks wearing. I find that interesting because this is considered the Southeast. We always act like it's some completely separate culture. But if you see King Peter Basso and how his helmet or crown is on his head, it resembles the Mende and Vai Angola masks. So I found that interesting. But this is a sketch from 1681. 1681. Here he is, he's not naked, he's wearing fine clothing.
Yeah.
And his entire court or cabinet also wearing attire. The only people that are wearing the loincloth are the guards who bring the Europeans in. The other powerful image here, Barbeau drew himself standing in the presence of the king. He wasn't allowed to sit. So this is not conquest. This is exploration. We'll bring you here. We'll bring you here. You're going to stand in front of our king and tell us what you've come to do. Frenchmen, they had an established relationship with the British, right? But not the French. So he's a stranger. The French are strangers. So it's not necessarily a hostile situation, but it is a show of force and power. Barbeau is not allowed to sit in the presence of the king.
I mean, I'm looking at where they are sitting. Look at the house. It's a round hut, but it's elegant.
The cross ventilation, right? You have the cross ventilation built in. I mean, we're talking about a period of sophistication that predated a period of destruction. Human advancement and the evolution of culture is not a straight line. Sometimes you take a leap backwards because of some tragic devastation. In our case, that tragedy was a series of wars perpetrated by the transatlantic slave trade that destroyed much of what we remember about our past. And when the Republic was established, it was done towards the end, the latter part of the transatlantic slave trade. So there had already been much devastation. So it's very difficult for people to think of a time when we were advanced like this and didn't suffer from some inferiority complex or some, situation that made us think that we were not at the level of others. It is the slave trade that creates that perception, not only of those who were enslaved, but those who remained on the continent of Africa. It also devastated their psyche as well. Go ahead, Dennis.
French traveler P. Grampier, about 1726, recommended the country around the river Sessos as the appropriate site of a colony. He announced that his ambition was to fit out a large fleet filled with able and intelligent people to make a conquest of this fine country and change its nature by introducing the best social laws and religious knowledge.
Yes. So this is the first you're trying to see of like a cultural, a cultural conquest, right? Because the Europeans have now figured out that if you can get Africans to culturally assimilate, you're more easily able to influence your trade position. And that's what this was about. But you have to remember, this place is being ruled by the descendants of John Davis, Yeyia, the descendants of Candia. And what Candia did by sending his son to Europe to study was great for the rest of us. Because again, to reemphasize, put John Davis in a position where he and his son, Peter Bassa, understood the importance of maintaining their economic control of their resources, their economic self-determination. And Candibia's son, Yeyia, put into his son, King Peter Bassa, who then puts into his son, whose name is also King Peter, this understanding that you must maintain control of the economic resources in your territory. Do not relinquish control of your resources to anyone. This is a running theme that I have found among these men. We can go to the next slide. So now this is 1727. So this is now the son of King Peter Bassa. Now you have King Peter, Lord of Mesurado, which is again a descendant of Candia, whose son Yeyia changed his name to John Davis, had King Peter Bassa. King Peter Bassa brings forth King Peter, Lord of Mesurado. So 1727, French traveler Cavalier de Maché says what? In 1727, the King Peter, Lord of Mesurado, presented to Cavalier de Maché, a French traveler, an island later called Bushrod Island for the purpose of establishing a colony. De Maché insisted on having the colony placed at Cape Mesurado and submitted the scheme to the Senegal Company. But according to de Maché, King Peter, the son of Peter Bassa, said, no, you can have Bushrod Island behind me. You can settle here. We won't stop you because we want to trade with you. We enjoy what we're getting. But you will not have the control of our ports, of our seaports. You will have to pass through us to even trade with your fellow Frenchmen. You will pay tariffs to me. So before you can even trade with other Europeans, you will be coming from what we call today Bushrod Island, or what was called King's Island at the time. You have to pass through me, pay my taxes before you can even trade. The French had already set up a scheme at Senegambia, which was under a private entity called the Senegal Company. where they were stationed at the coast. They had done the same thing in what is now Abidjan. The British had done the same thing in what would become Lagos and Accra and Elmina. But they could not do this at Cape Mesurado. They could not do this along our coast because we had a legacy that had been passed down to not relinquish control of our resources and our trade to anyone. This legacy continued well even after the Republic of Liberia was established. But we'll explain that in a little bit. So I just want you to remember, now you have a generational legacy of people refusing, even in the height of the slave trade, which you're talking about 1727, where African people are now subjugated. We fast forward now, we are now in the clutches of this transatlantic slave trade. But these men still have economic self-determination and the dignity to resist economic colonization, economic control by foreigners. This is powerful. This needs to be taught in schools in Liberia. This is our legacy. This is what we come from. And very few Africans can boast of this on the continent. This is not just resistance by one person. This is generational resistance to economic sabotage, generational resistance. We can go to the next slide. Dennis?
A Sweetie Ulrich, Nonden's Court, in 1776, proposed a scheme for the colonization of Cape Mount and Cape Mesurado and suggested the establishment of sugar plantations by the settlers.
So the Swedish come in, late, Johnny come lately Swedes come to the coast. They try to cajole another King Peter, which is the son of the King Peter in the previous slide, which is the grandson of King Peter Basa. And what does he say? No.
So
you
King
cannot.
Peter, the Lord of Mesurado now, this is his son.
Yes. And what does he say to the Swedes? No, you cannot. You will not establish a colony here. And colony, not in the sense of modern African colonialism. This is an economic colony. This is a settlement of Europeans where they're going to be establishing trade, not political control, but trade. This is about economic trade, control of resources, ebbs and flows of resources. They are being resisted. The Swedes are told, no, you cannot. And they did not. Because a lot of this stuff, that agreement, that just takes one foolish leader to say, oh yeah, come, it over. But now you have another generation of resistance. And this is the year 1776, which consequently is the year the United States got their independence from England. And England was engaged in that incredible war, very violent war in the Americas. And therefore, it gives a little bit of edge for the Swedes to come in, because now the other Europeans, the weaker, smaller European countries, oh, England is fighting its children in the Americas. Let's go and try to establish our foothold. And Cape Mesurado was still available because the French didn't have a foothold there. The English didn't have a foothold there. It was still controlled by Africans. So where do the Swedes go? To where they see sovereign Africans and see if they can negotiate. And again, the answer is no. You cannot. We will trade with you, but you will not control the trade.
We're not signing no 60-year agreement.
We will trade with you, but you will not control the trade. So it brings us. So I just wrapped up from that legacy of resistance.
Yeah.
It continued even with ACS. When ACS wanted to settle, they were initially told no. The person that gave them a little bit of edgeway, right, was what's his name? Oh my gosh, now I'm forgetting this guy's name. When at Cape, oh my goodness.
They are half white guy.
Yeah, I'm so terrible. My mind is running all over the place. So when ACS arrived, finally it was Smith, John S. Smith, John S. Mills, who gave them what was called at the time Perseverance Island, that became Providence Island. That's the only reason they even had a little bit of foothold, to even come in a little bit. But King Peter Brumley, who is yet another descendant, who was probably the brother of this man, Peter Pana. So this is a descendant. This is an actual drawing or painting, portrait of Prince Peter of Cape Mesurado, who went to Europe in the most unfortunate way. So it was Prince Peter's father who had said no, right? So we're going to get into Prince Peter. We're going to talk a little bit about how he was kidnapped and sold into slavery, because his father was a slave trader. Because since King Peter Bathol, all of the descendants after that, though they were resistant to European control, they were willingly, still engaged in the slave trade. And they were using the weapons and ammunition that they were obtaining from the Europeans to maintain their power position against other Africans. So here's their son. This is an actual portrait of their son in Europe before he died.
Carl, let's take 2 minutes and talk about, you said these kings were participating in the slave trade.
Yes.
What actually were they doing? Because this is one thing that we try to maybe cover or don't say, or kind of shy away, that we too, these kings were selling fellow Africans. So
they were selling human beings,
okay,
but they didn't see as their fellow anything. They saw them as people that they could sell. They saw them as something other than themselves. Right? They didn't think, in this period in time, though they all looked similar, the concept of being an African is something that was really imposed upon Africans, right? Africans saw themselves as Bambara, they saw themselves as Fulani, right? They saw themselves as Baso, or maybe Grebo, or maybe they saw themselves as Maninka, Manu. They didn't really see themselves as just Africans. So you have enemies, and you have greed, and you have all the tenets of human beings. I mean, human beings are wicked. Human beings do wicked things. Human beings do kind things and courageous things. All human beings do. And in this particular case, there were always willing participants in this trade. There were some Africans, people we call Africans today, there were some people living on the continent of Africa who felt that this trade was economically beneficial to them. A good way to get rid of their enemies and to get more weapons or whatever else they were trading with the Europeans. There's a lot of other psychological stuff that was going on. Europeans use a lot of tactics, getting people hooked on all kinds of alcohol. Many of these kings later on became drunkards, extreme alcoholics hooked on this rum. They would sell people just to get more rum, more rum and guns, which is one of the reasons when Liberia was established, they made a policy to not trade rum with indigenous kings because it was weaponized against Africans. The same way you see Kush and things tearing people up today, that's what this this rum that was coming to our coast was also doing. So yes, they were engaged in the slave trade. They will wage war on weaker people. They would wage war and for the purpose of acquiring captives and selling them. They would also purchase captives from people in the north who would bring them down to the coast and sell them to these kings so they could then be sold to Europeans. So it was a horrific situation. And these wars destabilized the region. These wars depopulated the region, caused all kinds of havoc, which is why you see the cultural shift. It broke down kingdoms and disbanded people that were for centuries band together. Now you have what resembles statelessness. And then people come and interpret that post-devastation as culture because it's what they saw, but they don't know how things got that way.
Good. The following is a true account of the manner of enslaving Prince Peter, the son of King Peter of Cape Masurado on the green coast of Africa. King Peter had a favorite slave named Dapu, who he always entrusted to take goods to sell on board of the shipping belonging to the different settlements. One day, as he was going to take some rice and elephant teeth and other articles to dispose of on board of a small trading vessel, he enticed Prince Peter to go with him. And when he had got him on board, sold him with the goods, and run off himself to his own country. The young prince was carried to Sierra Leone and put on board a slave ship commanded by Captain Fraser. Captain Fraser, after hearing that he was the son of King Peter of Cape Masurado, took him ashore on Ben's Island to Captain Carey, who is settled there. Captain Carey gave 2 slaves for his prince and kept him until he could meet with a proper opportunity to send him to his father again. So this
is a tragedy. We can go to the next slide. It continues.
Sometime after Captain Bevins, who is employed by Med Coats and Eden, London merchants that deal in the wax and elephant teeth trade, arrived there, and Captain Carey entrusted Prince Peter to the care of Captain Bevins to take him home to his father, King Peter, as Captain Bevins intended to touch there for the remainder of his cargo of elephant's teeth. Carey desired Captain Bevins to get 2 slaves from King Peter for the ransom of his son. Amen.
Very sad, right?
Hmm.
We can go to the next slide unless you have questions on that.
When they arrived at Cape Masurado, there was a ship lying at anchor there, which Captain Bevins hailed and asked whether King Peter was on board of the vessel that day. It is usual for the chiefs to go on board with the merchandise. They answered him that he was on board yesterday, and they expected him on board that day as they laid off on the coast. There were 3 boats put off from the shore to know what traffic they wanted. The 2 first boats attempted to come alongside, but the captain would not let them, during which time Prince Peter was hid away in the hold below. Soon after, the third boat was allowed to come. The captain, that the prince might not be discovered, went further down the coast to a place called Cruz. Boats were clear of the ship. The prince was ordered upon the deck again to work, and then the captain cheered him and told him that when he returned, he would carry him to his father. And this is from the British Manuscript, Volume 4.
Yeah, this was published in January 1788. So King Peter Pana, if you go back to slide 13, who is pictured there, was painted when he was in Europe. He died in captivity. Though he wasn't enslaved, they didn't allow him to go home. And remember, in this period of time, Europe was full of all kinds of filth diseases, dysentery, and God knows what else, right? And so he got sick. He got gravely ill and he died, and he's buried in England. And he never made it home. His brother, he's King Peter Brumley, is the King Peter that ACS meets in 1822. So this is very important when we talk about the fluidity of ethnicity. The fluidity of ethnicity. I don't use the word tribe because I believe it's diminutive. But you have descendants of people from cestos who are now they Bassa people. How does it happen? Conquest. Expansion of your territory. So the Dey become part of the Cestos kingdom, in a sense. And they're just basically another branch of the Bassa people. The last bus stop for the Cestos kingdom was the Ve, or what we call Bai. That's where they're, and maybe also the Gola, that's where it kind of stopped. But it reigned all the way at this point to Cape Mesurado. That's powerful. Now they're past the St. John, they've gone and extended the reign to Monserrato, or Mesurado at the time. This is incredible. And this young man, there's a couple of theories. It could have been that this enslaved person acted on his own and just wickedly sold the king's son into slavery. There's also a possibility, very strong possibility, that King Peter Brumley's people, because they had different mothers, said, you know what, sell Peter Pana, he's soft, get rid of him. Our son is taller and more handsome anyway.
So he can be the
King Peter Brumley will take over from his pa. Get rid of Peter Pana. King Peter Brumley could also read and write, and he spoke English. So education at that time was the property of very elite people at that time in history. So the idea of people, okay, oh, King Peter Brumley didn't understand about selling land. His great grandfather knew about selling land that he would not know. You understand?
Yeah.
We're not talking about ignorant, isolated people. And I wanted to point this out because, Dennis, I don't know if it occurred to you, the British are writing about how the king's son was missing. And they put out like an APB looking for him at every ship. Y'all tell us where this kid, why would they be running around helter-skelter looking for the son of King Peter of Cape Mesurado if he wasn't powerful? He was a powerful trade ally. They had to find his son.
Yeah.
Mind you, they had been sending, these guys have been going to Liverpool now, not London like their ancestor, but to Liverpool to study. So you have a legacy of people who had been going to Europe and returning. We know that King Peter, Lord of Mesurado, had gone to Liverpool and studied and returned. So it wasn't strange for people to go to Europe and come back. But the circumstances under which King Peter Pana was sold is what caused the issue and later led to his death. He wasn't well. Even though they treated him well, gave him clothes to wear, and he was respected, he got sick and he died before he could return home. And his brother becomes the King Peter we all know. Now, I also want to point out that Zolu Duma is another King Peter who was in Cape Mount. He called himself King Peter Careful. The British called him King Peter Careful. That is not the same Peter we call Long Peter that the bridge was named after. Zolu Duma was King Peter Careful of Cape Mount. So we can go to the last slide. There's one other article I wanted to point out that talks about Prince Peter Pana, who was sold and died in Europe, and then that will end my presentation, Dennis. And then we can ask questions and see who has any questions or comments.
If you were just joining us, this is the Liberia History Channel. We are discussing our In Search of King Peter. If you have you want to join the conversation, please call 605-313-6004. The code is 791403#. So, April 1781. I was informed that a young African was going to be conveyed on board a vessel bound for Sierra Leone. Curiosity induced me to inquire in what capacity he was to be sent there, as the grand question respecting the abolition of the slave trade had then become a merited object of universal investigation, particularly in this island. I soon discovered that the master of this poor Negro had no other intention in conveying him out of this country than to dispose of him afterwards with the greater facility for the West India market. In order to reinstate his expenses with profit, on closer inquiry, I found that this youth, whose name was Peter Pana, was really a son of the present Peter, king of Macerado, who had himself been educated at Liverpool by the slave traders. I discovered further that he had been kidnapped from his father, conveyed to a Mr. Harmon at Sierra Leone by an English slave vessel, Captain Fraser, and sold there to a Captain Cambibe, who carried him to the West Indies, where he met with other slaves from his own country, who immediately recognized him to be their king's son. This fact was moreover proved by the mark he bore on his breast, which is inscribed on all the king's children to distinguish them from others. From Dr. Franklin's.
Yes. So I just wanted to share this because it's another account. So this was published in 1784, and the other was published in 1788. So this is something that took the world by storm. This kidnapping of King Peter's son, Prince Peter Pana, King Peter Brumley's brother. This was a massive issue. So it seems to me that the descendants of King Peter, Lord of Macerado, a lot of those young men carried the name Peter as well. And this is the legacy. This is the dynasty. We know that King Peter Brumley's descendants sought refuge from the Gola, who had been trying to exterminate the Day Basa, or the Day people, right? So the Gola, led by their fierce warrior, Gatomba, had been grabbing in the late 1820s a lot of the Day people, committing massacres and also selling them into slavery. King Peter Brumley and his remnants of his clan sought refuge among the settlement at Cape Macerado on the Macerado River, and they were accepted. Many of their descendants may not even know today that they're descendants of King Peter. They may think that their ancestors came on one ship because they assimilated so early on, even before Liberia was a republic. So it'd be interesting to know what became of those descendants, because they would have been incorporated fully into the settlement and become Liberian. They were among the first Liberian citizens. So here we are. That concludes this presentation on In Search of King Peter. I hope you're just as excited as I am to understand this story, this legacy that Liberia was built upon.
We found him, King Peter. We were in search of him. Now we found him. So Riverside Pro is asking, are all the Peters Basa? You're looking for ancestors.
Yeah, so the concept of, you know why I feel about the word Basa, is Portuguese, and it's not the real name of the ethnic group. None of the surrounding people call them Basa. It's just they're named after the place. But the ethnicity of Candia and their oldest known ancestor is definitely of the people of Riversess. which we call Bassa today. And they conquered a vast area which incorporated other related ethnic groups, which are like the Glebo, the Krau, or Kru, as we call them today. And some of those also in the forest regions, such as the Kran and maybe even Sapo and others. Now, as they expand, they intermarry with others. So they conquer Day people. Now they're all, so you're a combination. Ethnicity is fluid. There's no such thing. It's not biology, right? It's your culture. It's what language you speak. So his descendants are speaking Day hundreds of years later. So Bassa is not blood. It's language. It's culture. And that is fluid. That can change from generation to generation. But for the most part, King Peter Brumley was considered Day.
And Louis,
but his ancestor, clearly we've traced back to River Sess.
And who knows? Please talk a little bit about King Long Peter and King Bottle Beer.
Bottle Beer. So a lot of the Kru and coastal people, Grebels, they would take these names like Bottle of Beer. A lot of these people were not kings. We have to also distinguish between slave traders and kings who were slave traders. So the kings at the time, because the commerce in the late 1700s, early 1800s, unfortunately was a slave trade. A lot of these people who were, for lack of a better term, they were gangsters. A lot of these guys who were engaged in the slave trade were not actual true kings. They were warriors.
Warlords.
They were warlords. That's a good word. They were warlords. And so Bottle of Beer would have been a warlord, would have been somebody who was going out and snatching human beings by force and selling them into slavery. Not at all like King Peter, who was actually from a dynasty and from an educated class that was ruling the place for centuries. And one of the things that the disservices that the Europeans did was by not distinguishing these warlords from actual royalty. They didn't care. Whoever was trading with them will call you king. But I'm glad, one thing I would say, people say, oh, but why is all the records? Because the people wrote stuff down. If they didn't write stuff down, would we know it? No, we wouldn't know it. These things have been lost forever if they hadn't been documented by people who interacted with them. We would not know Candia. We would not know Dedewi Yakwa. We would not see his sketch if nobody drew him, if nobody wrote his information down. We wouldn't know about it. So we have to also embrace the fact that these things were documented for us to be able to read today and discuss.
River says, if the concept of being African was imposed by the Europeans and not to the belief of the African themselves, how did they resist colonization as a community or group working together for a common goal? Why they weren't disjointed in their resistance?
I don't know why you're making the assumptions that people weren't disjointed in the resistance. The concept of Pan-Africanism really was introduced by the repatriated people. That is a concept that was created in the diaspora. Because in the diaspora, you don't have time to be Yoruba or Hausa. You don't have time for that. So in the diaspora, you're just a Black person. You're just an African. So when you return home, this is how you embrace the continent. Right? So the concept of Pan-Africanism precedes colonialism itself. And the seat of it, the first inkling of it, is coming from people that settled in Liberia, right? You're talking about Elijah Johnson. The first seeds of it. Hilary Teague, the first seeds of it. Those are the people that are coming up with this stuff. So even if you look at Pan-African history, it always will take you back to Liberia. Edward Wilmot Blyden is always given the title of being the father of Pan-Africanism. Blyden was a Liberian before he was exiled to Sierra Leone. And he died a Liberian exiled in Sierra Leone. He never became a Sierra Leonean because Sierra Leone was not a country. It was a place. It was a colony for the British. But his country was always Liberia until his death. And it was in Liberia where he studied the works of Hilary Teague and evolved his thinking of the oneness of Africa. But when people are hyper spent on this concept of tribe and ethnicity, there is no such thing as Pan-Africanism. They're at each other's throats. Why Eritrea broke away from Ethiopia? Why is Biafra trying to separate from Nigeria? Why are Liberians hyper-focused on political decentralization and not resource decentralization? Because we've become onto this idea that the tribe is greater than the state. So we fight this. Pan-Africanism is the opposite of the things that we say and do all the time. I mean, we had a recent war that showed how incredibly pathetic our concept of nationhood is. Weak.
Right? So why the person was Peter? John David was a Christian, so he named his son Peter. Peter and John, two of them are disciples.
And all the Peters after name, and also you do realize there's lots of people named John Davis in Liberia.
Yeah.
So just because they were not kings, there were other John Davises that also took names of this ancestor. You might not know that, but that's what it is.
And in fact, James David is watching the show, so it might be related. All right. We don't have any call-up. Those are the, we have more comments, but those are the relevant ones.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, in fact, someone is asking you to go and he said, why? Yeah. He said, we the people of Basel really want this lady to go teach Basel High School and Grand Basel University. They always
live stream it for the children. Take it and let them watch it. This is 2024. I don't have to go there. The message can go there. And these things all these resources are available online for free. Take advantage of them if you know somebody that can benefit from it. We also do, the Liberia Leadership Academy is working on an ethical citizenship class, which begins with history and ends with civics. And we're in the second session right now. So y'all support that as well. Support that because all those things are driven with our resources, not just our time and commitment.
And this is I don't know why government can reach out to this lady because she's had a lot to give to our history. Well, the same government, Alfred, you two can help. Dry dog sweet. What would be we have you can go online and look at the Liberia History Channel playlist. These are resources that can be,
to speak to what he's saying about government, the Liberia broadcast system, this is their responsibility. It doesn't have to be me, but the responsibility is to create an atmosphere for Liberians to be able to learn, for citizens to be informed. And so the information we're presenting, I agree with you, Alfred. The government should promote focus on Liberia and the work that Mr. Jai is doing by trying to educate and share information with his fellow citizens. This is something that can be live streamed through the Liberia broadcasting system. That's what it's there for. Liberian people's tax dollars are going to support LBS. LBS should not just be about profit. You should also, because you're supported by tax revenue, these educational programs should be broadcast to the Liberian people as well, on radio, on television if possible, so that they can learn. This is the responsibility of government. So I agree with you, Alfred. I'm not going to dismiss what he said. He's correct. So, who's over there? What's the guy's name at LBS? Eugene, reach out to Dennis. Share some of these shows on the platform. Right. Y'all will know Eugene, y'all tell him, because that's what LBS should be doing.
When Legend Ronnie was there, we reached out. In fact, the first time they were charging us $200 for one episode.
There should be no charge. The Liberian citizens are already paying with their tax revenue to keep that place open. There should be non-paid programming if it's educational and beneficial to the people. You charge people for content that they're benefiting from. But educational stuff for the society should be at no cost. Even if you put it during an hour a day, it's what should be done. And if you read the act that created LBS, that is actually their responsibility. So thank you, Alfred. You're correct.
Right. And just to add, Carl, because we discussed this, that we're going to even redo the entire History Channel merely for radio broadcast, which is tons of resources being invested in there. But still, you have to literally go and beg people and pay them to teach their own people, and that's sad. I saw and I'm not going to say on air, but you reach out to all these people and nobody's even listening to you. Everything should be politics. I saw
Right.
mowing lawn anyway.
Which is one of the reasons why LBS and these should really take the responsibility of this free educational programming is so necessary, especially with our schools not having proper library, proper internet, all this kind of stuff. This is where the government needs to say, where are agencies that are supposed to be carrying some of this weight? Yeah. Radio and television broadcasting that's state-sponsored has to take the responsibility, and there should be no additional charge to the Liberian people for them to get information that is their property. Hilary Teague in 1847 said the first duty of a citizen is to be informed.
And Carl, in my hand here is an external hard drive. I have all our programs on here. So if you are at LBS or you are somewhere or even in your school, you can go and get one of these, put all the History Channel. So put them on here. You take them to a class and stream them. You don't need internet to do that. And let children watch it, and you talk to them. I mean, we were going to USIS to read old books. Now you have these things on the internet that you can download and take to class and say, hey, watch this, and I'm going to quiz you. I'm going to ask you questions from this. Nobody's doing that.
I mean, also, everything that we cite, there's sources. So if you even want PDFs, because it's important for children to read. I don't want children there watching videos, right? The videos are there to spark your interest so that you read and study for yourself. So if you need materials, I can send them to you electronically. No cost. It'd be my pleasure. Those things that are available electronically, I can share. But I don't want people to think that this is in place of children. Reading is very important. It helps your mind, your critical thinking processes, and many other things. So we want children to read. So even if we don't have libraries, we can do this digitally. We can print out stuff, or they can read it on their cell phones, their devices. Children must read. Helps to develop their critical thinking skills.
This is the Liberia History Channel. Join us tomorrow at 7 p.m. We're going to be discussing the roles and rights of women in Islam. Imam Jenica M. Toure and Abu Bakar Dukle will be my guest. Abu Bakar Dukle is a graduate of what we know today as the Harvard of Islamic education. That's the school in Egypt, over 1,000 years old.
So y'all doing a thing about women's rights in Islam. You're not bringing Muslim women to talk about it.
You bring in Muslim men.
You better bring a woman on there. I will be under the comments heckling y'all. If I see one woman on that platform.
If there are women who are willing, please find them for us, or you can come, and we'll be glad to host.
Ask the gentlemen who are coming to invite a woman to join them if possible. I think that's important. I really do, Dennis. That kind of topic is very important.
Yeah, it's very important. And
so if they themselves know someone they could invite to come, just to add the balance, I would like to hear as a non-Muslim person listening to that show to educate myself. It would be more comfortable for me to hear it from both men and women, not just a panel of men.
Yeah, we hope we have women who can step up. We've been trying, but we'll work with what we got. All right. Excellent. So that will be the end of it. Let's wrap this up. Carl, we talk about this generation of Peters, starting with the father Candia,
Yes.
John Davis, who is Dereku Yakwa,
Yes.
Peter Basso, Peter Lord of Maserado, and all these Peters. Now there is a misinformation in Liberia where we think that Zulu Duma is the King Peter, which is King Peter Bromley, but no, that's King Peter Careful of Cape
Yeah.
Brown. So we have found. Oh, I didn't have my belt. We're in search of King Peter, and we found King Peter. Let's wrap up. Carl, your closing.
Look, Liberian history is well documented. It's not something I didn't have to go dig under a rock to find it. It's not archaeology. It is well documented. People's firsthand primary source accounts. We just need to piece it all together. And we also need to make sure that the information that is well documented is shared with the descendants of the people who made the history and not buried and hidden from them and replaced with some really unfortunate and almost buffoonish narration of their past, which has caused more harm than good. The truth is very liberating. The truth is very empowering. And the historical records, had they been available to the population, had the population been informed about who we are and how we got to be where we were, many of the misfortunes that have occurred in Liberia may not have happened. And if our current leaders knew the legacy of economic self-determination that they stand on, if our current leaders were aware of this legacy of economic self-determination, perhaps they would be economically self-determinant themselves. Perhaps they would be less willing to be creating policy from the position of beggars. Perhaps they would, think differently about themselves and their own resources. So this is why history is important. It gives you a roadmap of how to conduct yourself. We stand on a legacy that's very important, and we cannot let that be forgotten. Thank you so much for watching, and thanks, Dennis, for having me on.
Thank you so much for what you continue to do right here on the History Channel, the Leadership Academy, and all that you do to keep the legacy of Candia and others alive. We want to thank our viewers for watching. Always focus on Liberia, where we educate, we elevate, and promote all things Liberia. If you don't already know what we do here, our vision is to be the most educative and informative media institution that fosters knowledge and curiosity about Liberia. Our mission is to create a more enlightened and informed Liberian society that attracts the world. And our core values: truthfulness, accuracy, credibility, fairness, and respect. Until then, from me to you and all of us here at Focus on Liberia, we say have a good night as we close with our song that says, "We are all Liberians." Have a good night and God bless you.
We are Liberians.